Hello, folks. Scott Sigrist again. This week's lesson is on classical and Christian political theory, focusing on the pre modern period. And I'm going to break this up into two or three videos for better manageability. There's a lot of variety of material and could possibly run too long. This video, this segment, I'm going to talk about the big picture. And the first point is on Western civilization. Western civilization is really a product, I think it's fair to say, of Greek philosophy and Christianity. Um, this is sometimes, this dual influence is sometimes symbolized in terms of Athens and Jerusalem. Athens symbolizing Greek philosophy and culture, especially as coming through Athens. I mean, Athens was the Greek city-state that had the long-term impact. None of the others can claim to have much of any impact um, on later developments. And then Jerusalem symbolizes Hebrew, Judaic, and Christian thought and culture. Christianity was, as Toynbee said, the chrysalis of Western civilization, but Judaic thought was smuggled in through Christianity. I mean, the Christians accepted basically the Hebrew Bible as part of their scriptures, the old what they came to call the Old Testament, and just saw Christ and then later the New Testament as a sort of fulfillment and progression on the Old Testament. Rome has a claim to be a third city that you could mention. You could say Western civilization could be symbolized in terms of Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome because of the huge impact of uh, the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire on what came after, and there's no question about that. But you could also say in response to that that the thought and culture of Rome was essentially derivative of Greek thought and culture. Um, the philosophy of Rome was borrowed, for the most part, and tweaked here and there um, from the Greeks. And they borrowed the Greek religion. I mean, all of the Roman gods are basically renamed Greek gods. Zeus becomes Jupiter, and that kind of thing. Um, and and then Rome becomes dominant in the development of Western Christianity. Um, Certainly up to the modern period, it's dominant. The Bishop of Rome became sort of the first among equals um, among the leadership. They called them patriarchs in the East. Um, and Rome was sort of respected as having pride of place. It wasn't until later that, and the reason for that was that the apostles Peter and Paul both were martyred in Rome, and um, so it was considered to have special significance, and because of the Roman Empire and all of that, um, where it all began and took off outside of Palestine. Eh, so it wasn't until later that the Bishop of Rome became the Pope with extraordinary authority, even plenary power, um, including in moral and spiritual matters that affected political affairs. That came much later, and it actually brought a break with the Eastern Church, the rise of the papacy and the claim of papal infallibility in matters of faith and morals, at least in terms of the official ex cathedra statements of the church. Um, so 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 Rome plays a pivotal role, but I think it's still it it's still it's a vehicle first for Greek thought and culture, and then for Christian thought and culture. The most important philosophers in this tradition we're talking about up to the modern period are Plato and Aristotle on the Greek side, and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas on the Christian side. Um, Cicero was, I think, the most important philosopher, Roman philosopher. But Cicero himself says in a couple of places that really his project is just Latinizing Plato and Aristotle. He pointed to Plato and Aristotle as the gold standard of philosophy. So it's derivative again. Certainly Cicero put some really interesting original twists on Plato and Aristotle's thought, but essentially that's what he thought he was doing, is bringing Plato and Aristotle into the Roman context. Now for a brief nutshell history of Western political thought and development. Greek philosophy, there were Greek philosophers before Socrates, the pre-Socratics, as they're called. But Socrates started the tradition of moral and political philosophy in Greek that had the long-term following and impact in Western thought and practice, political practice. Cicero said Socrates brought philosophy down from the heavens to focus on human affairs. The pre-Socratics had more of a cosmic vision, focus. They focused on nature at large, and Socrates wanted to focus on human life, the meaning of human life, the way human beings should live, what's good for human beings, and all that. Socrates is one of many wise men wandering around at that time period. That wasn't uncommon for these for men to go around philosophizing. Many of them for money, because they claimed to teach justice, virtue, statesmanship, and so on. And they were generally called the sophists. Comes from Sophia, the Greek word for wisdom. And Socrates was thought by some to be just another one of these. Aristophanes, in his play The Clouds, which focuses on Socrates, presents him as representative of the philosophers, meaning essentially the sophists. And he presents Socrates in a very negative light, as being alternatively buffoonish, representing philosophers through him as head in the clouds, lacking any practical value for society, and so forth. Still a common perspective on philosophers today. Or alternatively destructive, deconstructing everybody's beliefs and then leaving them with nothing, which is worse than something, and leaving them disoriented and potentially dangerous, because they may sort of become nihilists. In Aristophanes' Clouds, one of Socrates' trainees becomes a figure that claims injustice is better than justice, and he beats up his father, and so on. And then Socrates is sort of to blame in the play. And Socrates thought that this played a role in poisoning the jury when he was brought up for trial on the charges of corrupting the youth. Among other things, I'll talk more about that later. And Socrates, in his defense, said his old accusers, and he explicitly mentions Aristophanes were much more dangerous to him than the new ones, because the charges being brought before him were by people of no particular significance, people who had an axe to grind and so forth. But the general presentation of Socrates by Aristophanes certainly put him in a very bad light and made people suspicious of him. And at that time, that was, watching plays was the primary form of entertainment, and pretty much everybody in Athens would have seen this. So, but anyway, Socrates was going around um, having conversations with people, asking them the questions about what's most important in life, questioning their own presuppositions, which also often made him resented and made people angry sometimes. He had these conversations also with very powerful people, as well as just ordinary people. He would talk to anybody who was willing to engage. And one of the people following him around was Plato, young man. And Plato writes this dialogue, the Apology of Socrates, with apology here meaning defense, not I'm sorry, I wish I hadn't done that kind of thing, but a defense. And he's very inspired by Socrates, and Socrates becomes a hero to him for dying for what he believed in when he's executed by the Athenian jury. And Plato's many dialogues use Socrates as a vehicle, as a mouthpiece for what he wants to say. We can probably assume that a lot of it is what Socrates actually said, or not word for word, but basically his ideas. But we can't be sure exactly what is Socrates and what's Plato in them. And there are a couple of dialogues where Socrates doesn't make an appearance. In Plato's very last, what's thought to be his very last dialogue, the Laws, Socrates doesn't appear at all. The main figure is called the Athenian stranger, and a lot of people think that's Plato for once speaking in his own voice in his final last word on political philosophy. But Plato formed a school called the Academy, and people came to study philosophy there. One of the students in Plato's Lyceum was Aristotle. And Aristotle was very influenced by Plato. Much of Aristotle's writings are kind of a reworking of Plato, with more of a systematic organization, topical organization of the themes. He sometimes pointedly disagrees with Plato on things, but in the big picture, it seems that he's mostly in tune with Plato's thinking. When Plato retires from the Academy, Aristotle is one of the candidates for replacing him as leader of the school, but they give it to another character who I think was related to Plato. And so Aristotle left and formed his own school called the Lyceum. And one of Aristotle's pupils, somebody he tutored, was a guy named Alexander, who became Alexander the Great. And through Alexander the Great, Greek philosophy and culture, as it appeared in Athens, was spread all over the world when Alexander went on his conquests, his campaign to take over the world, basically. I don't know if Aristotle would have approved of that, but certainly Alexander's spread of Greek civilization was probably part of what Alexander wanted to do, and it certainly was an effect, whether he intended it or not. The context of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle there coming to prominence in Athens was a shattered Greek world after the Peloponnesian War. We talked about this in our last lecture on Thucydides. This Peloponnesian War was really a 30-year conflict, and in 30 years, a lot of damage was done, a lot of social breakdown. And in particular, Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle were worried about the moral disorientation of Athens. And so that was their special focus. They were Plato and Aristotle were comprehensive philosophers. I mean, they dealt with all areas of knowledge, especially Aristotle, but still political philosophy, including moral philosophy or ethics, was the sort of center of their um, thought. But Greek civilization and Greek philosophy, as epitomized by Plato and Aristotle, was spread far and wide by Alexander, and then by Rome, when Rome came to prominence and took over even more of the world. Again, the culture of Rome, the intellectual and artistic and so forth culture of Rome was Greek. So Greek civilization was now all over the European world, stretching all the way to the furthest reaches of the what eventually became known as the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes Byzantine Empire, but Eastern Rome is what they call themselves over there. So Eastern Roman Empire is more correct, with its center in Constantinople. Christian political thought development right from the beginning. Early church fathers, within 100 years of Christ, if not earlier, were political theorizing and explicitly engaging the Greek philosophers. Actually, St. Paul in the Bible engages the Greek philosophers. Famous passage in Acts where he is talking to Greeks on, I think it specifies on the Acropolis, and trying to make his case for Christianity with reference to a tomb to the unknown God, who says, well, this unknown God is the God that is spoken of in Christianity. There was some debate among Christian thinkers and leaders, pastors, etc., over whether the Greeks should be embraced, Plato and Aristotle in particular. Some thought that, well, we don't need these pagans. We have everything we need to know through revelation, and there's no point. That was not the view that ultimately took hold. Mainline Christianity embraced Greek philosophy, embraced Plato and Aristotle as not entirely adequate, but basically true as far as they went. They thought it was highly consistent. Augustine, writing in the 400s AD, says that Plato is someone worth reading. If you're going to read philosophy, Plato is really valuable, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Thomas Aquinas was influenced by Aristotle more. He's writing another 800 years after Augustine in the High Middle Ages, 1200s. And he is the greatest of the medieval Christian political thinkers. And Christian political thought in the medieval period is where natural law became more or less a mainstream understanding of moral thought. And then late medieval and early modern Christian-inspired natural law theorists um, became the leaders of Christian political thought, including somebody we're going to read named Vittoria, who has very interesting just war theory ideas, and dealt specifically with the treatment of Native Americans when the European powers were taking over the New World. Um, very interesting things to say on that. Moral concerns about that. A couple of thoughts on the relation, more thoughts on the relation between Greek and Christian political thought. I mentioned the Church Fathers' engagement with the Greeks. Augustine and Plato is an interesting story. Augustine probably is the one that really most cements Plato's place in Christian political thought. Augustine he was not a Christian as a young man. His mother was a Christian, but was distraught by the fact that he didn't really take it seriously, and he had a long intellectual journey to Christianity, going through Manichaeanism and Platonism. He said it was Plato that really convinced him of the reality of the spiritual realm. He had been a materialist. He had been a theist, but he thought God was sort of the sum total of matter in the universe, and this great pulsating universe is God. And Plato convinced him of the spiritual. And so he played a pivotal role on Augustine's road to Christianity. In fact, in Augustine's Confessions, he says that with Plato's help of the Platonic writers in general, he made the ascent that Plato symbolizes in the cave image to the divine good, and had called it a ravishing vision of God. But he said it was as if I saw God from afar off. And it was Christianity that brought the sense of intimacy with God that Augustine was longing for. All this described in Augustine's Confessions. Thomas Aquinas was, as I said, influenced by Aristotle, and he really made Aristotle the philosopher. Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, which we'll talk about more later, often calls Aristotle just the philosopher. And everybody knows what he means, because by the medieval period, Aristotle has become widely considered, not only in the Greek world, but in the Islamic world. The Muslims had, through their conquest, come under the influence of Aristotle's thought. And the Summa Theologica, which is a sum of theology, or sort of a complete theological Christian vision of the world, Aquinas uses Aristotle to do this. He tries to philosophically work out this theology in Aristotelian terms, and he's understood as someone who synthesized Christianity and Aristotelian thought, and then Aristotle's primary role in Christian political thought was cemented. And still today, Thomas Aquinas is considered the philosopher of the Catholic Church. We'll talk more about that later as well. But after Aristotle, you had the development, or with Aristotle, you could say, I guess, when he became central focus for the Christian thinkers, you had a development sometimes called the Aristotelian Christian tradition. There was a mainline stream of thought um, typified by reflection on natural law and various types of divine law and the relation to human law and government. Um, and also importing Aristotle's ideas about forms of government and virtue and so forth. That became the mainline tradition of Christian political thought, which it kept for about 1,000 years, so a pretty good run. So that's a basic overview. There's one more thing I wanted to add, was the major themes of Greek and Christian political philosophy. So for the Greeks, I would single out these. First, human nature. Human nature was the foundational consideration for them. You had to understand human nature to understand politics, and that was worked out very systematically. Then the idea of a natural order. Human beings, there was a naturally right order for human beings, internally and socially, and human beings had a place within a larger natural order, extending up to the divine and down to nothingness, inanimate matter, and then nothingness. A focus on virtue, a development of philosophy of the foundations and ends of political community, and finally, an elaboration and development of principles about political regime types. In Christian political thought, you had all the same. They adopted those same foci in political philosophy, but they added a number of things that are very important. First was a focus on, or a systematic reflection on history, on the direction of history. The advent of Christ meant that there was a pivotal event in history that sort of changed everything and required a reinterpretation of the past as well as consideration of the future, and biblical revelation suggested there's an ultimate end of history, an ultimate destination, and this had a huge impact on Western thought. It remains to today. The concern of history and the idea that history has a direction. Second, an emphasis on equality. The Greeks, you could say that they understood or had an idea of equality. Aristotle makes ideas about equality the central concern of justice, but Plato and Aristotle tended to emphasize differences of natural human capacities, such that there's a kind of rank in society, and the Christian philosophers more or less accepted this. There's a variety of talents, gifts, as St. Paul called them, and corresponding roles in society. But there was a much greater emphasis on equality. Not only that people had the basic elements of the soul in the same kind of order that the soul should have and that kind of thing, but that every single human being, even the outcasts, the people who were considered cursed by the gods, by the pagans, the lepers and the lame and so on, all of these people had eternal value as well for the Christians. Everyone made in the image of God, and so this idea of equality became much more pronounced in Christian political thought. Then there was the idea of, correspondingly, of a universal humanity. I mean, not only the world was becoming more globalized, you could say. I mean, there's more awareness of other civilizations and cultures with the growth of the Roman Empire. And this idea of equality meant that all human beings are equal, not just the Greeks or the Romans, whatever. The idea was there with the Greeks that certainly would have been basic agreement on that point, but the vision of the possibility that human beings could be sort of have a kinship across national boundaries and so forth. This rises to the fore. There's a greater emphasis on peace uh, among the Christians, avoiding warfare as much as possible. Um, the notion of a peaceful order to society, peace being the goal of politics, as a realistic goal of politics, as opposed to the good or justice in the full sense, which uh, with their emphasis on sin and human corruption, they were less optimistic about than um, some of the Greeks. The development of just war theory is very important for the Christians. Uh, there were some principles established, very basic principles established by um, Aristotle, and then Cicero um, reflects much more systematically on the question of just war. But it doesn't become a tradition with a whole lot of thinkers contributing until the Christian thinkers. Um, there was also a new problem with Christianity in terms of citizenship in two cities. I mean, you're part of the city of God, as Augustine called it, but also an earthly city, which have different priorities. So you had potentially conflicting loyalties, and this often made Christians suspect um, to non-Christians, certainly in the early Roman Empire. This is a big factor in the persecution of Christians. Um, and then you have new problems such as church-state relations. What is the relation between the religious, the pagans, meaning non-Christians, always had, or pre-Christians, non-Jews as well, always had state religion, and religion was there was a religion of the state. But Christianity, there was always a certain either implicit or explicit separation. There were different jurisdictions, and the church had its own peculiar authority, and that brought it sometimes into conflict with the state. And then finally, there were problems related to monotheism. And this was one of the other things that made people object to Christian religion as opposed to pagan religion, because the pagans had many gods, and you could have, the god of you had to kind of go along with the god of your city, but but that was perfectly fine for other cities to have different gods, and you wouldn't think anything of it. Christianity claims there's only one God, and then by implication, all of the other gods, the people claimed, or beings claimed to be God, were not really gods at all. They were either demons, which is the worst, or they were just pure superstition. And then, of course, later on you had a clash of monotheisms when Islam rises to power. So we have a whole slew of new issues with the development of Christianity and of Western civilization. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Next lesson I'll talk about the Greek philosophers more in depth.